ok para a vinheta, tá? Que demora um pouco
Tá
para
bom.
carregar.
E, pessoal, a gente precisa deixar as câmeras desligadas para não
Tá bom.
vazar o vídeo para o YouTube. Aí nós avisamos aqui pelo chat quando for para ativar de novo. Professor Guy, we need to close our videos for the opening video,
Okay,
and we will let you know when to open again via
Okay.
chat, okay?
okay, so do I close mine as well, or,
Yes, please.
okay?
Thank you.
É tudo certo, gente. Pode colocar a vinheta.
Bom dia.
Olá, bom dia a todas e todos. Eu sou Vanessa Elias de Oliveira, sou presidente da Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política e tenho a honra de apresentar o nosso conferencista de hoje, professor Guy Peters. Professor Guy Peters é professor de Ciência Política da Universidade de Pittsburgh e atua também na Canada School of Public Service, na City University of Hong Kong e na University Center for International Studies, dentre outras. O professor Guy Peters é um dos principais nomes do campo de políticas públicas, é autor de mais de 60 livros em ciência política e editor fundador da European Political Science Review e da Governance. Dentre suas principais obras, que são inúmeras, como eu disse, mais de 60 livros, podemos citar algumas delas, que são também bastante conhecidas na ciência política e nas políticas públicas aqui no Brasil: The Politics of Bureaucracy, Policy Dynamics, Governance, Politics and the Modern State, Handbook of Public Administration e muitas outras. Então, é com enorme prazer que eu passo a palavra ao professor Guy Peters, agradecendo mais uma vez por aceitar nosso convite. O professor Guy Peters vai fazer uma fala de entre 45 minutos e 1 hora, e depois nós vamos abrir para os debates. Vocês fiquem à vontade para usar o chat do Zoom ou do YouTube para enviarem as suas perguntas. Depois eu vou ler aqui e colocando as perguntas para o professor. Thank you, Professor Guy Peters, for accepting our invitation to be here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, now let me get, okay, so I was asked to talk about global governance, and to talk about global governance in the context of a variety of different issues that now face all of our countries and face the world, since indeed we are talking about global governance. Okay, now, so it's first, let me say that it's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. I wish I could be there in person. I've had many interesting and enjoyable trips to Brazil in the past, but just could not make it in person for this event, unfortunately. So now, so the problem of global governance is an extremely challenging form of governance, especially in the context of the theme of your conference on inequality, justice, and the global South. So all of these then require, to deal with all of these issues, requires some form of global as opposed to strictly national or subnational forms of governance. To deal with any of these issues requires some sort of concerted action. With dealing with highly complex issues about that cover again a wide range of countries now. So let me first talk about the concept of governance. We talk about global governance, we talk about governance in general. What do we mean by governance? Okay, it's a very old word. We use it all the time. But basically governance is about steering. It's about the capacity to, and the definition here on this slide is the steering of the economy and society to collectively selected goals. So what we're talking about is the ability to set goals and then find the mechanisms for reaching those goals. And it has the, etymologically, it has the same root as words like cybernetics. So what we're talking about then is a science of control, the ability to control things and to try to reach important selected goals. Now in governance, public policies are the primary means of steering. So there's a lot of mutuality between the work the research that has been done on governance and the research that's been done on public policy. So the basic process is the same: agenda setting, legitimation, implementation, evaluation. So all the things we talk about with public policy, we can also talk about with governance. But with governance, we're talking public policy becomes the means to the end and not the end itself. And in current thinking, and I think to some extent historically, the role of the state has become contested in governance theory. So there's been a lot of debate, particularly in domestic governance, on the capacity of non-state actors to provide governance. So people like Roderick Rhodes from Britain have talked about governance without government, the capacity for self-organizing groups of social actors to steer society and to do it more effectively than governments themselves, largely because they're less bureaucratic, they're quicker, they're more nimble, and arguably can be more democratic. I don't have time to contest all those issues this morning because I want to talk about the global aspects. But I think it's almost impossible to think of a governance without the state, without some form of legitimate state action. If nothing else, the state essentially delegates authority to and legitimates the actions of the non-state actors. And indeed, the impact of governance activities by those non-state actors depends upon the nature of the state, just how open it is to those actors, how authoritative it is, how legitimate it is. So a global governance, then we follow the same basic idea. We're talking about the capacity to steer. And global is one of many adjectives that's been applied to governance. So we talk at times about good governance. We talk about multi-level governance, a great deal of literature, particularly about the European Union in terms of multi-level governance. We talk about informal governance. Helmke and Levitsky's work on informal governance, particularly in Latin America. I think it's important to point out the role by which non-state actors can be involved, but always in the context of the state. But anyway, global governance is perhaps the most problematic of these terms. That is, how do we steer the world? Can we steer the world? And can we steer that toward goals that are agreed upon? So there, I couldn't help myself by including this little cartoon that came from The Economist a few weeks ago. And it shows Secretary General Guterres talking to the world about using fossil fuels. And as you can see, he is talking, this is urgent. This has to be done immediately. We have to change at once. But the world ignores him. So here we have presumably the man who's responsible for the United Nations being incapable of really steering the world away from fossil fuels. Now, the cartoon is a bit of an exaggeration. And of course, what cartoons usually are, and is meant to be. But it does point to the weakness of many transnational governance mechanisms. So the global governance lacks the types of mechanisms that are important for governance at the national level. But it also points to the importance, so that we need to control, if we want to control climate change, it has to be done at international, transnational level. So there's perhaps more truth than exaggeration than there is in this cartoon. We're dealing with an issue then that transnational governance is crucial for solving most of the major problems that confront us. Okay, change, please. So what is global governance? It's governance with adjectives, obviously, but Michael Zern, German scholar, gave, I think, probably as good a definition as any. That it's the exercise of authority across national borders, as well as consented norms and rules beyond the nation state, both of them justified with reference to common goals or transnational problems. So, and this definition includes most of the elements, if not all the elements, that I talked about in terms of governance. We're talking about norms, rules. We're talking about controls. We're talking about exercise of authority. Now, as I'll point out in a few minutes, the notion of authority at the international level, the transnational level, is questionable. So I think the one thing with which I would disagree with CERN is that the use of authority. I think other mechanisms are at least as important as authority in dealing with transnational governance issues. But again, I'll try to elaborate that more in a few minutes. Okay, to change that. Okay, so there's a fundamental paradox in global governance. That fundamental paradox is that the most difficult problems in the world that the world faces must be addressed by global governance of some sort, which is the weakest form of governance and the weakest source of governance. That is, nation states can control their populations, even subnational units. The states in Brazil or the United States can control their citizens and activities of businesses, whatever, much more effectively than can global governance entities. So here we have that essentially you're dealing with a set of global collective action problems. The standard definition, of course, of being a collective action here being that we're dealing with a set of problems that with individuals or corporations or states pursue their own self-interest, we're all worse off. So if each state pursues its own self-interest in terms of climate change and doesn't invest money in climate change, then we're all worse off. It's not something that can be handled by a single nation. Same way with migration. Migration involves working together between the North and the South, particularly, and between individual nations to produce some sort of form for dealing with those issues. So interestingly, the European Union just came up with a set of 10 laws and 10 agreements with many of particularly the countries in Africa, to try to come up with some sort of more regulated form of migration between Africa and to some extent the Middle East and Europe. Now, this has just happened. We've yet to see if it's going to work. But here's an attempt really to try to deal with the migration issue in a more collective manner. Food security, another sort of classic problem of this sort, and inequality, which is one of the topics of your conference this year. And inequality, again, there's inequality among individuals, among states, and even among non-state actors, all of which then have to be addressed by some form of collective action. But unfortunately, global governance is the weakest form of action to try to deal with those types of issues. So why is global governance so weak? Why can't it perform better in terms of dealing with these big issues? The weaknesses are relatively easy to identify, but much harder to actually cope with. From a steering perspective, there are four big weaknesses in global governance. The first of these are the institutions. Now, I'll deal with each of these in more detail as I go through here in a few moments. But there's no shortage of institutions. In fact, there may be too many institutions, because some of the institutions get in each other's way. But the institutions themselves often don't have the powers that are needed to deal with the collective action problems that we've been talking about. Secondly, there are problems with goals. Who sets goals for the world? Now, perhaps the United Nations, perhaps some form of others collective or transnational organizations. But goal setting then is even more difficult than it is at the national level. Thirdly are the instrumentalities for governing. If you want to make things happen, how do you make them happen? Same notion here as policy instruments. So what sort of tools does global governance have, do global governors have to be able to govern effectively? And then finally, policy coherence. That is having relatively coherent, coordinated action across a range of topics and a range of countries. Indeed, if it's going to be truly effective, it needs to reach perhaps all countries, not just a few. So those four basic questions about global governance really then structure how we can think about the capacity to govern globally. So let me talk about them each somewhat in more detail. So as I said a moment ago, there's no shortage of institutions, but they're highly segmented. Now, to some extent, this is true at the national level as well, but perhaps even more so at the global level or transnational level. They're segmented by policy. So we have the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the private sector, Médecins Sans Frontières, a variety of other types of organizations, both not-for-profit, not representing not-for-profits, but sometimes representing for-profit entities. So there's a whole range of entities out there dealing with specific policy issues. Just as in the nation state, there are ministries or departments that deal with separate policy topics, creating for the states themselves coordination problems. Okay, now these international organizations also are segmented by the clientele that they serve. For example, UNICEF serves children, and their basic topic is they provide a range of services for children, but only for children. Okay, they're also segmented by region: the European Union, the North American Free Trade Area, Mercosur, etc. So we have regional organizations then that are part of this international framework of institutions. And then finally, some organizations that are based upon criteria. If you're rich enough, you can belong to OECD. And if you meet other criteria, you can belong to OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is primarily European, North American, and Tibetan. So a variety of forms of segmentation of the groups, and in part thereby huge number of organizations that we have to try to make work together if we want to produce any sort of meaningful global governance. Now, some of this, for those of you who are international relations scholars, will be familiar from the notion of regime theory. So you can think about there being a number of different policy regimes in the international environment. There's one for health, the WHO playing a major role, national health ministries playing a major role, various not-for-profits, again, like Medicine Doctors Without Borders, and the drug industries, and other and medical licensing agencies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all having some role to play in that large complex regime. Now, there's really no authority within that regime. It depends upon collaboration. The WHO, to a great extent, plays a leading role. But even then, it can't control. So I've done some research with colleagues on how the pandemic was handled, excuse me, how antimicrobial resistance is being handled. So, you know, that if everyone takes antibiotics, but doesn't take them carefully, the microbes, the germs, develop resistance, and those germs then become almost unstoppable. There are no effective drugs against them. Now, so the WHO has been trying to coordinate this, been trying to get all the national health associations or ministries to adopt common standards, common practices, but largely has failed because everybody wants to do things their own way, or they don't have the resources to deal with the topic, or both. So these regimes then are very complex, but often generally lack authority. And in general, though, within all these areas, the less comprehensive a regime is, the more effective it's likely to be. So that is, the more focused a regime is, the more focused a set of actors in global governance are, the more likely they are to be effective. Given the large diversity of interests that may be involved, the more you add larger range of interests. But at the same time, that the focused associations and regimes are more effective, the problems are comprehensive. So again, if we take that list of classic wicked problems like climate change, it includes almost every aspect of life. And so trying to control it then involves virtually everything that governments do and that you and I do. So if we really want to deal with this issue, we have to deal with it comprehensively, not piecemeal. Whereas the institutional structures and the regime structures are to a great extent piecemeal. Okay, secondly, goal setting. So if we have a set of institutions, again, one can't be but so optimistic about those institutions, but we have them. So then we have to ask the question to govern, where do we want to be? Where do we want our society and the world to be in 2030, in 2050? What sort of world do we want for 2030 or 2050? And then think about how to get there. Now, we know from domestic politics that agreement on ends is difficult. That is, agreement on where we want to be is often difficult, particularly as politics has become more fragmented. But agreement on the means of getting there tend to be even more difficult. So maybe we can all agree that we want to be richer. We want to have economic growth. But how do we get there? Do we get there by nationalization, the state taking over the instruments of production? Or do we get there by more equal distribution of income, better wage settlements for workers? How do we get there? How do we make our countries richer? And therefore, how do we make the world richer, if that's our goal? So there's likely to be even more conflict about mechanisms than there is about the goals themselves. And at the international level, at the transnational level, goals tend to be vague if worthy. They're often more aspirational than operational. Now, I don't want to be rude here about these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I know, from previous visits to Brazil, that Brazil invested a great deal of time and energy in the SDGs. And they're important goals, but they're to some extent not operational. They don't have the means of getting there. And many of the means of getting to the goals of the SDGs are national rather than transnational. So it depends then very much upon the ability of the international actors to influence national governments if we actually are going to reach these transnational goals. So they're wonderful, but they are to some extent vague. And again, they are aspirations rather perhaps than operations. And the danger with goal setting, of course, and like the SDGs or any other major goals, is that big goals lead to big failures. If you say you're going to do something and you don't, then you look to be a failure. So governments then, I've always had the question of whether one thinks about goals in a more incremental, more or bit by bit way of trying to achieve ends, or setting these big targets that then often lead again to big failures. And the final part about goal setting is, can we have democratic goal setting at the international level? Now, or at the transnational level. Good example here is the European Union. So the European Union composed of 27 democratic regimes, but yet there's constant debate over the democratic within the European Union. So the actors, the member states are democratic, but then trying to create goals and means at the transnational level becomes democratic somewhat indirectly. And so in trying to move that beyond a set of a couple dozen relatively homogeneous countries to the global governance is challenging, to say the least. So big questions then about the capacity for democratic goal setting at the transnational level. Okay, thirdly, in terms of those topics that I laid out a moment ago, are the instrumentalities. What do we use to govern? So I'm using a slightly different term from policy instruments, but it's the same basic idea. We have a policy, we have a set of goals. How do we get there? How do we make it work? And the answer is we make it work through a set of policy instruments. And this is much the same as is true for national or subnational governments. And we can use Chris Hood's familiar, I hope, set of 4 forms of instruments that he uses the acronym NATO for: nodality, authority, treasure, and organization. Now, I want to talk about 2 of those. First, authority. So you remember when I was from Michael Zern's definition of transnational governance, he talks about using authority. Now, and authority is linked to legitimacy. So is the entity, the state or the transnational actor that is trying to make rules and enforce rules, is it legitimate? do the people accept its legitimacy, its essentially its correctness, its appropriateness as a source of rules. Obviously, back to my cartoon, the world didn't in dealing with Mr. Guterres. They simply ignored it. His pleas for trying to deal with climate change. So what we're dealing with here then, with authority and with instrumentalities in general, is a fundamental problem with enforcement and compliance. So if we want global governance, we have to have enforcement and compliance. And that's hard to produce internationally. Some of the specialized international organizations do have such mechanisms, notably the World Trade Organization. It has the ability to sanction its members. The International Criminal Court has sanctions if they can get a hold of the targets of their sanctions. So, but some do, but most don't have the real capacity to really strictly enforce their rules and to use authority. And again, so the notion of authority and legitimacy is to a great extent based upon community. That is a sense of we-ness, that we all belong to one community, that somehow we all belong to a global community. And if we have that sense of belonging to that community, then we may be able to create authority. Then people are willing to suspend their own resistance, thinking that the rules that are being made are correct, are proper, or in the terms of new institutionalism, are appropriate. So governing transnationally, or indeed governing nationally, often involves redistribution. It involves some deprivations by some or perhaps all people in order to reach common goals and to create the common good. So if we want to deal with inequality as one of the topics of your conference, then somebody has to give up something. The more affluent have to give up some of their wealth, whether those more affluent entities are states, individuals, corporations, whomever. So this redistribution then is difficult even nationally, and it's particularly difficult transnationally. So politicians have a hard time explaining to their citizens that they should give up things to help somebody else who is not a member of the same community. So we've yet to develop that global community. Now, to some extent, that community exists slightly and with somewhat weak forms in organizations such as the European Union that I mentioned a moment ago, NATO, and perhaps to a tiny bit in Mercosur. But for the most part, it doesn't. And sometimes in crises, we're able to create that sense of community. So during the pandemic, we all were in this together, that we had to create some sort of global health regime, at least in the short term, because the virus didn't respect borders. It had to be dealt with transnationally, and therefore we needed some mechanisms to try to deal with it transnationally. So a lot of this then, if you're familiar with the term wicked problems, most of what we're dealing with here are wicked problems that have no clear solutions, that require large-scale interventions and involve redistribution. And sometimes massive and obvious redistribution. Now, sometimes national governments can hide levels of redistribution. Tax systems and spending systems are very complex. So the clever government can often hide who's paying for what goes on and who gets what. And often they want to, because they want to redistribute. whether to the less affluent or from the less affluent. So, so we're dealing then with a set of massive problems at the global level, which involve that sense of community and belonging, if they're ever going to be solved effectively. Okay, so if we don't have authority, we're often left with governing through nodality, through information. So information becomes the crucial means of global governance. And this information is used in a variety of different ways. One is standard setting, public and private. So ISO standards, for example, international standards for a whole variety of products and services, then our way of using information, does the product or service meet the international standard or not? And that service then can be provided to consumers and can be used as a means of evaluation, not only of the product, but also of how well governance is occurring. We can use league tables. One of the best examples is PISA, not the city in Italy, but the program in International Scholastic Achievement. So it's a big program run by the OECD on assessing the quality of education around the world. And so every several years, they do a standardized test in a number of countries and then rank those countries. And almost every year, Singapore and Shanghai come out on top. They don't do all of China, just the city of Shanghai. And poorer countries come out near the bottom. The United States comes out somewhere in the middle. But it's a way then of exposing the quality of education to national leaders and to parents, and hopefully thereby forcing action. And then another good example is the open method of coordination, naming and shaming. So in the European Union, the open method of coordination basically involves setting standards and having regular meetings of representatives of health ministries or education ministries or whatever ministry to see if the nations involved were meeting those standards. And if not, again, naming them and shaming them, hopefully to produce action and better concerted effort. So internationally, if we can't govern effectively, what do we do? If we can't use authority, what do? We use nodality, we use information, but we also use what Abbott and Snydell and others have called orchestration, where you have essentially what would be called at a domestic level policy entrepreneurs. You have individuals or perhaps a group that become an entrepreneur trying to create a set of rules and the means of enforcing them. So a good example here might be the creation of the International Agreement on Landmines, which was basically brought about by a small group of activists who began in Montreal with an agreement and produced a international agreement that most countries honor about the use of landmines in conflicts. Now, so this wasn't done by the states. It was done with the resistance of a lot of states. But yet it was able to be successful in the end because of these entrepreneurs. So policy entrepreneurs at the domestic and the international level are really important actors. And to some extent, therefore, there's been a huge literature in political science about bringing the state back in as if it ever left, but about bringing the state back in. But maybe we also need to get the state back out and to allow some more space for this entrepreneurial activity. Okay, I think I've already mentioned this, the material on regimes and regime complexes. But, well, I mean, yes, I already mentioned the regimes from international relations theory. These focus groups of actors. But then we can even think about an even more difficult mechanism of regime complexes. That is, regimes, the environment of regimes is other regimes. And so if you have a regime in health, for example, great, we can deal with health issues. But we can't, because we can't really deal with health issues unless we deal with social services, unless we deal with inequality, unless we deal with food, unless we deal with housing. So every regime then just becomes to some extent dependent upon its neighboring regimes. So we need not only then to deal with the individual policy domains, but also then with the interactions among them. So again, these international entities and processes have domestic analogs. A governance without government, I mentioned earlier. So again, the role of the private sector, both in regimes and at the national level. Policy entrepreneurs, or at the international level, called by Snydal and Abbott, orchestrators. Delegation from government to non-state actors, and network governance. So regimes look very much like network governance models. All that's lovely. All that is, sounds great. All you have to do is put all these people together, get them to work together, and get all the unicorns to fly, and we'll be fine. So I'm obviously being somewhat facetious here. But can you get the state out of anything significant? States represent their people, and they represent national interest. So even if you're not a hardcore realist in international politics, states do have interest. And it's indeed the task of the state to represent what they consider to be the interests of their citizens. And likewise, each regime, each policy domain wants to preserve its own interest. The health people want to deal with their own concerns. The agriculture people have their own concerns, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. And sometimes they talk, if not they talk different languages. If not Portuguese and English and French, they talk different professional languages. So they have a hard time communicating, and therefore have a harder time cooperating. And so this produces then a lot of private power. So in global governance, I would argue that to a great extent, private power is at least as important as public power. So you're dealing with a lot of regimes, numerous regimes that are dominated by private interest as opposed to the public interest. And this also then in turn leads to increased power to the global north, and perhaps increasing power to the global north. And the final of those four concerns that I had about global governance, and I've been going on a long time, I'll try to move quickly here, is policy coherence. So how do you produce a set of policies that are coordinated and that essentially work together effectively? Now, this is difficult at all levels of government. Aaron Wildavsky, one of the grand old men of public policy analysis, said that policy coordination was the philosopher's stone of public policy. If you could produce coordination, you could govern effectively. And to some extent, that's true, and even perhaps even more so at the transnational level. So we have multiple actors of all sorts. Again, I mentioned the Migration Pact and the European Union. Trying to get them to work together is very difficult. So who is the coordinator? Who's in charge? Now, to some extent, the United States played that role for international security. But that's been declining. And if the Trump advanced team is elected, it will decline even more. So some nation states have been the source of coordination internationally. And some organizations, perhaps like G7, G20, are the source of some policy coherence. But trying to create the coherence is difficult. So I want to close with a few further paradoxes in global governance. I like to think in terms of paradoxes. I don't know why, but I do. Anyway, so the first paradox then is that a system composed primarily of authoritative actors depends upon collaboration and informality. So we think of the international system as composed of nation states, and it is, but it's also composed of a lot of non-state actors. And those non-state actors may be more important than the states in producing collaboration and informal governance. But secondly, while collaboration is difficult, particularly because the states have few incentives, again, it's the task of the state to protect its citizens and to not give away too much through collaboration. So, even just as one example, just in the morning's news, at least here in the U.S., President Biden negotiated a deal with Russia to release some prisoners. Now, so the first thing that the opposition, the Republican opposition, asked was, what did he give up? What American interests were undermined to get those 4 prisoners back? So it's hard then for the states and for state actors to give up things. It doesn't look good to the citizenry politically. Thirdly, global governance depends on the very actors, states, that make it difficult to be effective. Fourthly, again, this is perhaps repetitive, in global governance, private actors may be the primary source of public goods. So we think about public goods as being peculiarly public. That is, it's something that only governments can produce. But again, we see that in global governance, private orchestrators, private entrepreneurs, would be the individuals or more commonly groups, are able to produce public goods. They're able to produce global public goods. Again, landmine treaty is one good example. And then finally, global governance is large scale, it's massive scale. But the small scale solutions seem to be most effective. And you can think about Elinor Ostrom here and her work on dealing with essentially collective action problems. So she got her Nobel Prize largely because of her work on how to solve collective action problems. And most of her solutions were small scale. They worked in villages. They worked in small communities where they did have this sense of belonging. So the individual fishermen, for example, could agree among themselves about fishing quotas and enforce it among themselves. Farmers could agree upon how much irrigation water each could receive. Now, that's great. Everybody knows each other. They belong to the same community. It's very hard to scale that up. It's very hard to move that up to even to a small city, much less to the world, much less to global governance. So we have to think, in terms of how to scale things up or how to delegate, how to use those possibilities of smaller scale solutions. So I hope this hasn't been too depressing in terms of global governance. I mean, the more I talk, the more I realize I've been rather negative about this, but I think that the problems are real. So let me just conclude then with 4 basic questions about global governance. How can we make decisions? How can we make decisions about goals, about the means to reach those goals? How do we make good decisions? Not just decisions for the sake of making decisions, but decisions that actually deal with some collective action problems. And how can we make decisions, good decisions, that produce results? So how do we implement those good decisions? What sort of mechanisms are available for implementation? And then finally, and perhaps the big one, which may solve the previous three questions, is how do we create community? If I had the answer, I probably wouldn't be here this morning. But I think it's to some extent a fundamental question about global governance, is creating some sort of sense of community. Now, crisis may do this. If we begin to recognize that climate change is indeed an existential crisis, then perhaps we can. But it's a very difficult prospect, or very difficult task, I should say, to create that sort of sense of global, transnational community. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Obrigado for your attention. And I hope you have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guy Peters. It was great to hear you. And I think you bring us a lot of questions. We also don't have answers for them.
I wish I did.
Yeah, but they are important questions for sure. Yeah, I'll say that the audience can send those questions, even in Portuguese, and then I can translate for you. But I will start considering that I have this great position of being here coordinating this conversation. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about this last topic that you've mentioned about global, climate change. I mean, we have already a lot of scientific knowledge that shows us that we are in a very difficult situation in terms of climate change, and the necessity of taking care of the gas emissions and environmental issues. So considering that, how far you think we are from having a kind of global governance for this specific topic? Because we are almost in a crisis, or sometimes scientists say that we are already in a crisis. So why it's so difficult to have a kind of global agreement in terms of what can we do to fight climate change?
Well, I think the primary issue, the primary difficulty, is essentially people have to give up an awful lot, and particularly the more affluent and the more powerful countries. So you have to give up fossil fuels. You have to give up, flying to Brazil for a conference, which I can say I did my little bit, not willingly, as it turned out, but we have to give up things we like. And again, and governments like to distribute benefits. They don't like to distribute cost. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're going to govern climate change, so it's gotten to the point now where we're going to have to distribute cost, and perhaps big cost. And that's hard to do. I mean, the famous speech that Winston Churchill made when he became prime minister, that he had nothing to offer but blood, sweat, and tears. That's rarely a very good political platform. Mm-hmm. So politicians then like to promise that they can produce climate reactions, but probably will have difficulty in actually making the sorts of changes at a national level that would produce the needed change. And I think the other part of this too becomes, I think, again, you were talking about the global south, becomes a north-south issue as well. I mean, that most of the pollution historically has been in the north, but that's been associated with development. So if you want to develop, if you want to have economic development, seemingly the route to take is fossil fuels, industry, using the very things that produce both development and climate change. So there becomes a sort of a double question about redistribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but well, considering that it's almost impossible to leave the situation, I mean, to change it. So we don't have nothing to do. I mean,
Well, I mean, I'm afraid that in so many cases like this, until it becomes so evident that there's something is happening. And there's evidence, obviously, in the heat this summer in the north. I mean, Pittsburgh, I think, has had more hot days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit than we've ever had before, et cetera, et cetera. So there's massive evidence. But still, it just doesn't seem to get through. And again, the willingness to accept the deprivations that are going to be required. I mean, I wish I had the answer.
Okay. No, I know that this is very hard, but the point is, how can we deal with that situation, considering that we already know that we are in danger, that we have a crisis, and that we don't have the answers for that? So that's something that we have to discuss more, of course. And let me ask you something else. How can we should include in the discussion of global governance judicial institutions? This is something I work with, and I think this is not always considered when we are talking about public policies and governance, and I would like to hear more about that.
Well, I think certainly they have a very important role to play. I mean, again, I think I mentioned just briefly the International Criminal Court is one of the few international organizations that it really does have strong sanctions available to it, assuming then that the member countries comply. So certainly judicial and within the European Union, within NAFTA, I think within Mercosur, there are judicial entities that help to then adjudicate the trade policies and other policies. So certainly they're a crucial actor in this, and forgive me for not including them as much as I might have, but they're certainly, I think, important. And again, but what we need to be sure is that they have the legitimacy. So courts work as long as their decisions are accepted as legitimate.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And so what's happening, for example, in the United States right now, is that the Supreme Court has been undermining its own legitimacy. So it's becoming less effective as an adjudicator, simply because of some of the decisions that it's made that seem to be political rather than judicial.
Yeah, we had the same discussion here in Brazil with Bolsonaro.
Yeah. And
but on the other hand, they are not submitted to the public opinion in terms of electoral processes. So at the same time, they sometimes can.
But I mean, but now I think the Supreme Court here has become a major political issue. So I don't know if you've seen, but President Biden introduced a set of laws to change both the Constitution and laws about the terms of justices. So it has become politicized, which is unfortunate. Because I think what we want to have with the courts is some sort of a non-political arbitrator. And I think it's clear that I think from what I know in Brazil to some extent, and in the US, they've become much more politicized. Yeah.
And it has side effects of that, of course, I had another question.
There's a really interesting, just to follow up on that, there's a really interesting scholar at the Harvard Law School, Mark Tushnet, who talks about the need for a new fourth branch. So what we need in government now is a fourth branch that can truly play that non-political, depoliticized, independent role.
So we have to create a new actor in this global governance structure.
That's his argument anyway.
Yeah, this is interesting, but this is another task, I think.
Yep,
and a
indeed.
difficult task because we will not agree about how it can or
Oh, no,
what is the
never.
main characters. So, but this is interesting. I have another question here from Jesus Manuel Delgado Mendes. Professor Peters, I agree with you when you say that affluent people and countries have to give up something. I believe that the real formula at the end is to consume less of everything, but how the new economy models will be adapted to this condition with global governance, or will be a national task at the end?
I think, good question. I think it has to be a national task. And it's a difficult task because economic growth has always been, jobs, et cetera, has always been, but particularly economic growth, has always been a indicator by which governments evaluate themselves. So if I'm a politician, I want to produce economic growth. But that also means then that I'm consuming and we're consuming more of everything. Yeah. So that's sort of the mindset of we as humans, I think, is always bigger and better. We always need more. The famous labor leader in the United States was once asked, what did he want for his members of his union? And he simply said, more.
Very direct.
Yeah. And so I think we all have, to some extent, that same sort of logic, that more is better. So in terms of the question, I don't know how we change that mindset of living smaller. I mean, obviously some people have, and in a variety of different ways have downsized, have gotten rid of their cars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some cities, for example, Paris, before the Olympics, trying to essentially get rid of cars in the city to make it more unfriendly to fossil fuel vehicles, doing all those things. So this may be one of these questions about the classic line, who was it from? I can't remember now, but think globally and act locally.
Yeah. So it will take some time for us to change our minds and mindset. Actually, yeah. Okay, I have a lot of questions here. Let me read 2 or 3 of them. Is that okay?
Okay.
Klaus Frey, my colleague from UFABC, said, thanks, Professor Guy Peters, for your challenging talk. I would like to know if you could talk more on the role of science in climate regimes. We saw in the case of the pandemic that many governments, not the Brazilian government, but followed the science, as Greta Thunberg used to request. How you see the role and the potentialities of the role of science as a central player in this regime? And Fiona Macaulay, she's asking, even if the crime of ecocide were accepted by the ICC as the 4th crime of humanity, would this have any effect on global governance of this issue?
Interesting questions. Okay. So on the latter one, if nothing else, it would highlight it. So sometimes symbols are important. So a symbol like that, I think, could really be important, saying that these individuals are creating a crime against humanity, or governments, or corporations, whomever the villain is, are. Now, whether that's actually going to be justiciable, how do you prove it or not, is, I think, quite another question. But the symbolic value is important. Now, can you repeat the first question?
The first one is related to the role of science in this
okay.
climate change regime. Yeah.
So I think there is So one thing we talk about in policy studies in terms of science are epistemic communities. So communities of knowledge. So, and there's clearly a very strong and integrated epistemic community in climate change, in climate science, that basically, 99 point something percent agree. Now, but you've got to get that science out to people. You've got to get it understood by the average person in the street. And they have to accept the science. Yeah, so it's all right for the scientists to agree among themselves. But I think, we have to then really have sort of a popular science as well that and it's not agreed upon. So, people would say, oh, it's hot today, but we've always had hot weather. Or there's a big hurricane this week, but we've always had hurricanes. So is it really anything different? So again, and denial in trying to maintain the status quo, again, it's a human trait. I think we try to preserve our status quo, particularly when change is costly.
Yeah. Including the scientists, because we have difficulty to deal with this communication with the audience. Yeah. We are maintaining our status quo. In
Right,
some
exactly,
sense.
yeah. So there was 10 or 15 years ago, the American Society of Engineers, I forgot the exact title, issued a press release saying that all citizens should learn calculus so they can communicate with scientists. And then the Modern Language Association the next day issued a press release saying that engineers should learn English so they can communicate with people. So I think the same thing is true about scientists in climate change.
Yeah.
Is that effective communication is important.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We have to do our task also. Okay, I have two more questions. Professor Agnes Amaral is saying, thank you, Professor Peters. Given that we are in a complex situation that is very difficult to remedy, I'd like to know if, in your view, the capacity of states and cities as more effective agencies in this fight could be more effective. If it's easier to do something at the local level or at the subnational level, I think that's it. And Guilherme Lima is asking about the participation of non-state actors in the UNFCCC processes, especially the local governments and municipal authorities. Do you believe those actors are effectively contributing to ratchet up? I think their ambitions in the climate regime are more likely to segment responsibilities within nation states. I mean, they are both asking if subnational actors are more efficient. Yeah.
Well, I think, that typically you have a greater sense of community if you're working at a local level, just as I was talking about Eleanor Ostrom's solution. To collective action problems. So is everything else being equal? Yes, I mean, you can do better certainly at a local level. When you move up to a state level in Brazil or the US, I mean, you're dealing with millions of people. So it's hard to create a deliberative process for millions of people. But so, the question here then is trying to find a means of, I'll use the term again, orchestrating hundreds of local actions to produce some sort of coordinated, larger scale action. So again, here, the policy coherence issue and the coordination issue becomes important. Because if Sao Paulo does one thing, Minister Elias does another thing, then, where you may not, you're not getting anywhere potentially. Now you can think of those as experiments, perhaps. If so different states, different cities can experiment, but ultimately you've got to come up with a solution or a set of solutions and some sort of more coordinated action.
Yeah,
But
Yeah.
clearly there is a role, I think, for local action.
Yeah, but this is a huge paradox. It's easier to do at the local level, but we are trying to do at global level. So
Right,
it's,
Right.
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I think we don't have more questions here. So I would like to thank you again, Professor Guy, and I want you to make some final comments if you want.
Oh, I would only say thank you for the opportunity. It was a challenging question that you gave me and good questions from your participants. And thanks again. And I enjoyed it and hope you did.
Thank you again. It's a pity that you couldn't be here, but I hope you can be here in another time, and maybe we can have another conversation on this topic in a more positive perspective,
Okay,
considering that we maybe can be more close to a global governance system than we are now. Let's see.
let's hope so. Okay,
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Yeah, bye-bye.
Professor. Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Obrigada a todas e todos pela participação. Seguimos com a programação hoje até o final do dia e a partir de segunda-feira, presencialmente em Salvador, para aqueles que estarão lá. E aproveitem o dia de hoje e obrigada.